if you had a long-term exposure or history of mold exposure, and you don't have the ability to get mycotoxins out of your body very effectively, then it can stay in your body for decades. The symptoms that are correlated with histamine intolerance are the same symptoms that a person might experience with mycotoxins.
Tamy, do you see any correlation between mold exposure and histamine intolerance in your practice?
Absolutely, 100%. I see mold all the time with the clients that I'm working with. In fact, I think it's a huge, huge trigger that's oftentimes overlooked. A lot of doctors don't understand it. In fact, in my own experience, when I was being tested with an immunologist, I was tested negative for a mold allergy, and I was told mold is not an issue for you. You don't need to worry about it. And it was a huge, huge issue for me. So what happens with mold is you don't have to have a mold allergy to have an issue with mold. It can still be activating your immune system. And what happens is the immune system is stimulated, and the mast cells that hold on to histamine and other inflammatory mediators, they degranulate, they become overly active, and just start dumping histamine and those other inflammatory chemicals into the body. So huge contributing factor with histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome.
And how could someone start to look into this if they don't have a mold allergy, but they're struggling with histamine, haven't figured everything out? Could they start to look in to see whether mold is part of the picture?
So, there's a couple of things that a person would and should look at. Number one, are you living in mold? Is your current environment moldy? You don't always see mold, and you don't always smell it. So sometimes some deeper investigation needs to be done. There are different ways of looking into that, but assessing your environment. And the other thing is you can test the body to see if mold is hanging out in the body. And an important thing to point out here is that there can be mold in the body and you're not currently living in mold. So just testing your environment isn't always enough, because sometimes you could have, if you're a person who has impaired detox pathways and drainage pathways, and you don't have the ability to get mycotoxins out of your body effectively, or if you had a really long-term exposure, maybe you were living in a moldy bedroom like I was growing up. My bedroom was underneath the bathroom that had a leak in the tub, and the ceiling was literally bowed like this. So I grew up in mold, and so I'm more hypersensitive to it and have a decreased ability to get it out of my body. So if you had a long-term exposure or history of mold exposure, and you don't have the ability to get mycotoxins out of your body very effectively, then it can stay in your body for decades. So you don't necessarily have to have a current exposure for that to be going on.
Okay. And then that can irritate the immune system and lead to some of the reactions, including the histamine release.
Exactly.
Okay. Are there symptoms that you see that correlate with this, or not necessarily?
100%. Yeah. So a lot of the symptoms that are correlated with histamine intolerance are the same symptoms that a person might experience with mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are known to cause over 200 different symptoms of in the body. And just like histamine intolerance, in virtually every system of the body. And why is this? It's because it triggers massive inflammation in the body and aggravates the mast cells. So mast cells are virtually everywhere in the body. These are the cells that hold on to histamine, and we have histamine receptors everywhere in the body. So they're triggering this massive inflammation through the body, leading to symptoms everywhere. So they can cause brain-related symptoms because they're neurotoxic. They cause oxidative stress. They're immunotoxic. They cause damage to the liver, the kidneys. Many mycotoxins are carcinogenic, GI toxic, reproductive, toxic to the reproductive system. So we can have symptoms everywhere. Burning and tingling in limbs, neuropathy, blurry vision, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, you name it. Weird symptom. We got to get people with all these weird symptoms that are unexplainable elsewhere. People think they're crazy. They're going to their doctor. Their doctors are telling them they just have anxiety. A lot of times it's mold.
Okay. Yeah. So a huge range of symptoms and like histamine, as we discussed in the full episode. Okay. And what kind of testing can a person use or do you like to use to look into this further?
So there are a couple different tests that I'll run. Both of it's a urine sample, same urine sample for both tests. One is a mycotoxin panel, and that panel is looking for various mycotoxins produced by different mold species that could be hanging out in your body in elevated levels. Different types of mycotoxins have impact in different systems of the body. And then the other test that I use to identify whether a person has become colonized with mold in their digestive tract. This happens, like I was saying earlier, when a person's had a long-term exposure and or they don't have the capacity to get rid of the mycotoxins very effectively. So essentially they become mold factories and it starts growing in them. So identify this on an organic acids test. That on that test, I also see elevated levels of oxalates, which I talked about in the full episode. Oxalate levels will be elevated when there's mold and also candida, which is always a tag along, because mold interferes with your the metabolic ability to get rid of the oxalates from the body. So they build up. I also see issues with neurotransmitters, mitochondria, all driven downstream issues of mold.
Yeah, causes some havoc in the body for sure. And how about in the environment? I think a really important point you've mentioned is that you don't always see it or smell it. So it can be a little tricky. Are there testing you recommend for the environment? Or if not, what are some other signs and clues people could look for to investigate, or even considering their history, if maybe it was a problem in the past, and even if it's not now?
So one quick thing is if you know that your current environment is not moldy because you've done testing to prove it, but you know that you previously lived in a home that had a lot of mold and you brought all that furniture with you and all the clothes with you, you probably brought the mold with you. So that could be a way that you're still exposing yourself in a new environment. Important to note. But when it comes to testing your current environment, there's no perfect method. I'm not an expert in the living space. I'm more an expert in getting it out of the body. But a very simple, quick, and easy way to assess if it's an issue, and then you're going to have to dig deeper if you find that it is little petri dishes that you can get. And they're just these little plastic petri dishes that have some little gelatinous stuff in them. And you test the different your rooms in your house with these petri dishes. They're like, I don't know, $3 each or something like that. And if there is mold in a room that you're testing, then colonies will grow on the petri dish. You can send it off to the lab and they'll assess what type of mold it is. And so that's one kind of cheap and easy way of us, kind of doing an initial assessment on the environment. And from there, if you discover that, yes, there is mold, and you can kind of narrow it down to a specific room where levels might be higher, then you got to do some deeper digging and get an environmental specialist or a mold specialist in there to do further testing and do a proper removal and remediation. So whether that is replacing air ducts where that's a common place that is mold is harbored, or replacing floorboards or whatever it may be that needs to be replaced. That's not my area of expertise, but you got to get somebody in there to dig deeper and fix the problem.
What are some like realizations or surprises people have that you work with them if, say, their body testing comes back and then they go either look in their current home or reflect back on their history? Are there any examples that people say, oh yeah, now that you mention it, like I noticed X, Y, and Z, and they just hadn't thought of it that way before?
All the time. Yeah, all the time. Just thinking about specific examples, people tell stories of, oh yeah, I lived in this house, or I was traveling around, living in different places in third world countries, or whatever it may be. People always have stories of different places that they live, and these light bulbs go on. And sometimes it's the current environment. I have a client that I'm working with right now that there's some structural thing underneath their home, and they cannot get the humidity level, no matter how many dehumidifiers they have running. They can't get the humidity level below 68% ever. So they've got to have some sort of structural engineer come in and figure out what's going on under the house that the humidity levels are so high all the time. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
Oh yeah, because I mean, just the whole topic of this episode here is connecting two things. I mean, histamine intolerance, if someone knows that's a problem, then to consider that mold could be connected, because it sounds like you see a very high correlation where there's a lot of overlap in the people you work with. And so, yeah, even for myself, when I never considered mold, thought much about it till it came back high on some of my tests. And the practitioner I was working with explained some of these issues, and I started learning more about it. And as I did, I realized, oh yeah, especially looking back at my history, I've been moved, in college, and then for a few years as a young professional, and then, moving cities, lived in a bunch of different places that all had some red flags. So all could have been potential, but I never even crossed my mind. So I think just putting the idea out there, especially if people have looked into a lot of different treatments or support, say for a histamine intolerance, or these ongoing chronic symptoms, and haven't gotten it handled, it could be really valuable to understand mold can be an issue, and just to get some ideas about where to start looking to dig deeper.
absolutely. Yeah, mold is a huge one. Huge, huge, huge. See it all the time.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Tammy.
You're welcome.